The Hun, the most feared man in the world. Imagine you are a farmer living in the year 434 AD. You have a small house, a few fields of wheat, a dog, maybe a couple of goats. Your town is inside the greatest empire the world has ever seen, the Roman Empire. Rome has armies, Rome has walls, Rome has laws that have kept people safe for hundreds of years. You feel safe, and then one morning, someone comes running into your village. Their face is pale, their hands are shaking, and they whisper two words that make every single person go completely silent. Attila's coming. Within minutes, everyone is running. They don't stop to pack, they don't stop to say goodbye to their homes, they just run, because every single person knows what those two words mean. They mean fire. They mean destruction. They mean that the most feared man on the entire planet, a man that the Romans themselves called the Scourge of God, is on his way. So who was this man? Where did he come from? How did one person frighten an entire empire so badly that historians are still writing about him 1600 years later? Buckle up, because today we are going on a journey back to one of the wildest, most dramatic, most jaw-dropping stories in all of human history. Today we tell the story of Attila the Hun. Attila Hun, the most feared man in the world. Chapter 1. Who were the Huns, the world before Attila? Before we can understand Attila, we have to understand the world he was born into. And that world? It was absolutely nothing like the world you know today. Picture this. It is roughly the year 400 AD. There is no internet, obviously, no phones, no cars, no countries as we know them. Most of Europe and parts of Asia are divided into kingdoms and empires, each one constantly fighting, trading, or making deals with the others. The biggest power in the Western world is the Roman Empire. You've probably heard of Rome, the Colosseum, gladiators, amazing roads and aqueducts that carried water into cities. Rome was like the superpower of its time. Think of it like the biggest, most powerful country in the world today. It stretched from England all the way to Egypt, from Spain to the borders of Persia. Hundreds of millions of people lived under its rule. But Rome had a problem. Actually, Rome had many problems, but the biggest one was this. Along its eastern and northern borders, something was changing. Something was moving. Tribes of warrior peoples who lived on the open plains, vast, flat grasslands called steppes, were on the march. And the most dangerous of all these warrior peoples were the Huns. So who were the Huns exactly? The Huns were a nomadic people, which means they didn't live in permanent cities or towns. Instead, they moved constantly across the great steppes of Central Asia, the enormous flat grasslands that stretch across what is today Kazakhstan, Russia, Mongolia, and parts of China. They followed their animals, horses, cattle, sheep, from pasture to pasture with the seasons, living in portable tents called yurts that could be packed up and moved in hours. Think of it like this. Instead of living in one house your whole life, imagine if your entire family moved every few weeks, packing everything you owned onto horses and wagons. That was life for the Huns. And because of this life, always moving, always surviving in harsh conditions, always riding horses from the time they were small children, the Huns developed into some of the most extraordinary warriors the ancient world had ever seen. Did you know that Hun children learned to ride horses before they could fully walk? Historians tell us that by the time a young Hun boy was 3 or 4 years old, he was already being placed on horseback. By the time he was a teenager, he could ride at full gallop, steer with his knees alone, freeing both hands, and fire a short, curved bow with deadly accuracy. Not while standing still, while riding at top speed. A Roman soldier who saw Hun cavalry in action reportedly said it was like watching something that wasn't quite human. They moved so fast. They struck so suddenly. They were there, and then they were gone, before you even had time to raise your shield. This was the world, and these were the people into which Attila would be born. But there's something else you need to know about the Huns before our story begins. By the time Attila's father and uncle were leading the Hunnic tribes, the Huns had already started moving west, out of the Central Asian steppes and into the heart of Europe. Why? Historians aren't entirely sure. Some think climate change on the steppes was making the grasslands drier. Some think it was pressure from other peoples further east, like tribes from Mongolia. Others think it was simply the Hunnic warrior spirit, a desire for new lands, more wealth, and more conquest. Whatever the reason, by roughly 370 AD, about 30 years before Attila was born, the Huns had already swept into Eastern Europe like a thunderstorm. They smashed through a powerful Germanic people called the Goths, scattering them into Roman territory. They toppled kingdom after kingdom. Whole peoples picked up and fled before them. The tremors from that first great Hunnic movement would eventually help cause the fall of the Western Roman Empire itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because right now there's a baby boy about to be born on the open plains, and that baby is going to change the world. Coming up next, we meet the young Attila and discover the extraordinary and unusual childhood that shaped him into the warrior he would become. But first, there's a secret that even Attila didn't know about himself when he was a child, a secret that would change everything. Chapter 2: The Birth and Childhood of a Future Conqueror. Attila was born around the year 406 AD. We don't know the exact date. We don't know the exact location. This isn't surprising. The Huns didn't keep written records the way the Romans did. They were an oral culture, which means they passed down stories, history, and information by speaking and remembering, not by writing books. So most of what we know about the Huns and Attila comes from Roman and Greek writers who either met the Huns personally or wrote down stories they had heard from people who had. What we do know is this: Attila was born into the ruling family of the Hunnic people. His father was a man named Mundzuk, and Mundzuk was the brother of two of the most powerful leaders the Huns had ever had, men named Oktar and Ruga, who jointly ruled over all the Hunnic tribes. So from the moment he was born, Attila was Hunnic royalty. Now in the Hunnic world, being royal didn't mean you got to sit around in a fancy palace being waited on by servants. There were no Hunnic palaces. There were no golden thrones or velvet curtains. Hunnic royalty meant something very different. It meant you had more responsibilities, more duties, more training. Because in a warrior culture, the greatest honor wasn't wealth. It was being the best, the strongest, the most skillful leader. And to be that, you had to work harder than anyone else. From a very young age, little Attila would have been placed on horseback. He would have learned to ride, to shoot a bow, to wrestle, to handle a spear. These weren't just games or sports. This was survival. This was his education. But here's something that might surprise you about Attila's education. It wasn't all fighting. The Hunnic royal family had a powerful and very interesting relationship with Rome. You see, by this point in history, the Huns and the Romans had made agreements with each other. The Huns provided military help to Rome. Hunnic warriors were genuinely terrifying fighters, and Rome was happy to hire them, and Rome paid the Huns in gold and goods. As part of these diplomatic arrangements, these deals between nations, it was common practice to exchange children as what were called hostages. Now this sounds terrible, but it worked differently than you might imagine. These children weren't prisoners being held in dungeons. They were young royals sent to live with the other side, given a good education, treated respectfully, and eventually returned home as adults. The idea was that if both sides had each other's children, neither side would want to attack the other. It was a way of building trust. And so, at some point, when he was still a boy, likely around age 7 or 8, Attila was sent to live with the Romans. Think about that for a moment. This little Hunnic boy, who had grown up on the open plains, who had learned to ride and shoot and live freely under the sky, was suddenly living inside Roman walls, eating Roman food, learning to speak Latin, the Roman language, being educated in Roman customs, Roman politics, Roman military strategy. And at the very same time, across the Roman border, a young Roman nobleman was sent to live with the Huns, to learn their ways. His name was Aetius, and he would grow up to become Rome's greatest general. One day, he and Attila would face each other across one of the most famous battlefields in history. But that's a story for later. For now, here is what matters about young Attila's time in Rome. He was smart, brilliantly, dangerously smart. He watched everything. He learned everything. He understood Roman military tactics, Roman politics, Roman weaknesses, and Roman strengths. He spoke and read Latin. He may have learned Greek. He understood how the Roman world worked from the inside. Can you imagine how valuable that knowledge would be? Imagine if you were planning to compete against a team in a big game, and you got to spend years living with that team, watching their practices, learning every trick they knew, and then you went home and used all of that to beat them. That's essentially what happened. Attila returned to his people as a young man with something most Hunnic warriors had never possessed, a deep, detailed understanding of the enemy. Did you know? The name Attila might actually come from a Gothic word meaning little father, or a Hunnic word related to the word for ocean or water. Some historians think it may have been a title rather than a birth name, meaning something like the Great One or Universal Ruler. The Huns spoke a language we don't fully understand, and many of their words and names came from other cultures they had encountered along the way. But Attila's return home was shadowed by tragedy. His father, Munzuk, had died while he was away, or possibly shortly after his return, and his two powerful uncles, Oktar and Ruga, were now the rulers of all the Huns. The young Attila was smart enough to be patient, for now he watched, he learned, he waited. His moment would come. Just ahead, the death of his uncles brings Attila and his brother to power, but ruling the Huns is no fairy tale. It's a brutal, dangerous world where the only thing standing between you and destruction is your own strength, cunning, and ruthlessness. The brothers are about to discover exactly what it means to rule the most feared army on earth. Chapter 3, Brothers in Power. Attila and Bleda take the throne. When Attila's uncle Ruga died in around 434 AD, something remarkable happened. Power over all the Hunnic tribes passed to two young men, Attila and his older brother Bleda. Together, they became the joint rulers, the co-kings, of the Hunnic Empire. Think of it like two presidents running the same country at the same time. In theory, they shared power equally. In practice, well, we'll get to that. But first, let's understand just how enormous the territory these two brothers now controlled actually was. The Hunnic realm at this point stretched across a vast swath of land, from the Rhine River in what is today Germany, all the way east to the Caspian Sea, which borders modern-day Kazakhstan and Iran. From the Danube River in the south, the border with the Roman Empire, all the way north into the forests and plains of what is today Ukraine, Poland, and Russia. That is an absolutely gigantic amount of land. Dozens of different peoples and tribes lived within this territory, many of them not Hunnic at all, Gothic, Germanic, Slavic, and Sarmatian peoples who had been conquered and now served under Hunnic authority, either as warriors in the Hunnic army or as subjects who paid tribute. Tribute, by the way, is a word that meant regular payments in gold, goods, or services that weaker groups made to stronger ones to keep the peace. It was basically like a protection fee. Pay us, and we won't attack you. Now, the Romans already knew about the Huns. They had been paying the Huns tribute for years, a practice that had started under Ruga and continued. But when Attila and Bleda came to power, they did something bold almost immediately. They demanded a meeting with Rome. Specifically, they demanded to meet with representatives of the Eastern Roman Empire, which, by this time, was based not in the city of Rome itself, but in a magnificent city on the Bosphorus Strait called Constantinople. That city is known today as Istanbul, in the country of Turkey. The Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes called the Byzantine Empire by modern historians, was actually the wealthier, more powerful half of what had once been one united Rome. It had enormous cities, extraordinary wealth, and a well-trained army. But it was also surrounded by threats on multiple sides. And so, in 435 AD, Roman representatives met Attila and Bleda at a place called Margus, probably near what is today the city of Požarevac in Serbia. The negotiations were unusual. See, the Huns refused to negotiate while sitting down, in the Roman fashion. They insisted on conducting the entire meeting on horseback, which, if you've ever tried to have a formal conversation while sitting on a horse, you can imagine was quite the challenge for the Romans. But the Romans had no choice. They needed the peace. The agreement they reached, called the Treaty of Margus, was a remarkable document and entirely on the Huns' terms. Rome agreed to double the annual payment of gold it sent to the Huns, from 350 pounds of gold per year to 700 pounds per year, return any Roman subjects who had fled into Roman territory to escape Hunnic rule, refuse shelter to any enemies of the Huns, and treat the Huns as equals, not as a lesser barbarian people, which is what most Romans privately thought. 700 pounds of gold per year. That's roughly the weight of 3 or 4 very large adult men, entirely in pure gold, every single year. This was an astonishing amount of wealth, and Attila had secured it through sheer negotiating power before firing a single arrow. But was Attila satisfied? What do you think? Did you know? The term barbarian is a word the Greeks and Romans used for any people who didn't speak Greek or Latin. The word itself came from what Greek speakers thought foreign languages sounded like, bar, as if they were just babbling. It was an insulting term. The Huns were fully aware that the Romans looked down on them, and Attila in particular took great offense at being treated as inferior. This played a big role in the wars that followed. For about 5 years after the Treaty of Margus, Attila and Bleda were busy consolidating power. They made sure all the tribes under their control knew who was in charge. They led raids. They punished those who didn't pay tribute. They expanded Hunnic influence. But trouble was brewing, not just on the Roman border, but closer to home. The relationship between Attila and his brother Bleda is one of the great mysteries of this period in history. We know they ruled together. We know they both commanded warriors and led campaigns. Ancient sources suggest they had different personalities. Bleda reportedly enjoyed parties, laughter, and a pet fool, a sort of court jester, who traveled with him. Attila, by contrast, was described as serious, calculating, disciplined, and almost severe in his habits. In 45 AD, Bleda died. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague about how. Some later writers suggested that Attila had his own brother killed, murdered in a hunting accident or a private confrontation. Other sources simply report his death without explanation. We honestly do not know for certain what happened. What we do know is what happened next. With Bleda gone, Attila was the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire. There was no one to share power with, no one to answer to, no one to hold him back. The floodgates were about to open. Attila is now the most powerful man in the Hunnic world, and he has a very specific plan in mind for what comes next. Rome's days of peaceful payments are over. In the next chapter, the wars begin, and they are going to be unlike anything the ancient world has ever seen. Chapter 4, The Scourge of God. Attila declares war on the Eastern Empire. Here is something important to understand about warfare in the ancient world. When a great army moved in the 400s AD, it didn't travel on roads with fuel stops and GPS directions. It moved on foot and horseback, carrying everything it needed, food, weapons, tents, medical supplies, with it. A large ancient army moving through your land was an absolutely devastating thing. It consumed every scrap of food it found, burned what it couldn't carry, and left behind a landscape of ash and ruin. And the Hunnic army wasn't just large. It was terrifyingly effective. Let's talk about how the Hunnic military actually worked, because it's genuinely fascinating. At the heart of the Hunnic fighting style was the horse archer, a warrior on horseback who could fire arrows with extraordinary speed and accuracy at full gallop. The Huns used a special type of bow called a composite reflex bow, made from layers of wood, bone, and sinew, animal tendons, that were carefully shaped and glued together. This made it much more powerful than a simple wooden bow, even though it was shorter and easier to use on horseback. Hun archers could fire up to 10 to 12 arrows per minute. That's one arrow every 5 or 6 seconds, while riding at full speed. When they attacked, they didn't charge in a straight line the way Roman infantry did. They would sweep in from multiple sides, launching clouds of arrows, then pulling away before the enemy could effectively fight back. Hit and run, hit and run. They were like a swarm of wasps, incredibly fast, painful, and nearly impossible to catch. And when the enemy was confused and demoralized from the arrows, then the Huns would charge in with lances and swords for the final devastating close-range attack. Roman military commanders, who had spent centuries developing tactics for fighting other infantry armies, found Hunnic warfare almost impossible to counter effectively. Now, back to Attila. The first major crack in the peace between the Huns and Rome actually started because of a church. It sounds almost funny, but here's what happened. Somewhere along the Danube River, the border between Hunnic territory and the Eastern Roman Empire, a Roman bishop, a Christian church leader, named Vigilus, was accused of looting graves inside Hunnic territory. To make matters worse, according to Attila's messengers, the bishop had stolen holy objects from land the Huns considered theirs. Whether this was the true reason, a convenient excuse, or a deliberate provocation, we can't know for sure. But Attila used it as a reason to act. Beginning around 440 AD, this is while Bleda was still alive, the Hunnic army crossed the Danube and began attacking Roman cities along the border. And when we say attacking, we don't mean little border skirmishes. We mean systematic, organized, and extraordinarily violent military campaigns that smashed through Roman defenses like a battering ram through a paper wall. City after city fell. Viminatium gone, Margus destroyed, Singidunum burned. Singidunum is the city we know today as Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. The Roman army in the region tried to fight back and was destroyed in open battle. One Roman commander who survived a battle against Attila reportedly said that the Huns didn't just defeat the Roman legions, they annihilated them so completely that there wasn't even enough left of the army to bury. Between roughly 441 and 447 AD, Attila led several devastating campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire. The details would fill multiple history books, but let me paint you a picture of what happened with some of the major moments. In 443 AD, after a brief truce that the Romans quickly broke, Attila returned with his full army and drove deep into Roman territory. His forces reached all the way to the outskirts of Constantinople itself, the great capital of the Eastern Empire, with its massive famous triple walls. Here's the thing about Constantinople's walls. They were considered basically impenetrable. Massive, layered stone fortifications built over generations. No one had ever successfully breached them from the outside. Attila looked at those walls. He had no siege engines powerful enough to break them. He couldn't go through them. So he did something clever. He simply laid waste to everything around Constantinople instead. He burned the countryside. He destroyed every city and town in the region. He cut off supply lines and communications. He demonstrated to the world that the most powerful city on earth could be completely surrounded and strangled by his forces. The Eastern Emperor at the time was a man named Theodosius II, and here's what Theodosius II did in response to Attila's devastating campaign. He paid. Oh, did he pay? The new peace treaty, signed in 443, was absolutely humiliating for Rome. The annual tribute, that gold payment, was tripled to 2,100 pounds of gold per year. Rome also had to pay an enormous one-time payment to make up for missed payments, roughly 6,000 pounds of gold. And the treaty again insisted that all Hunnic prisoners and deserters be returned. To put that in modern perspective, historians estimate that 6,000 pounds of gold at today's prices would be worth somewhere in the range of $150 to $200 million. And Rome had to hand it over all at once, essentially because Attila scared them into it. Did you know? In 447 AD, a series of massive earthquakes struck Constantinople, actually destroying sections of its famous walls. Attila launched another major campaign that very year, taking advantage of the moment. Roman engineers worked frantically, with civilian volunteers helping, and managed to repair the walls at almost miraculous speed before Attila's forces could reach the city. It was one of the most dramatic engineering feats in all of ancient history. By the time Attila's campaigns against the Eastern Empire wound down in the late 440s, he had accomplished something truly extraordinary. He had forced the most powerful empire in the world to pay him enormous sums of gold again and again without ever having to take their greatest city. He had destroyed dozens of Roman cities. He had killed or captured tens of thousands of Roman soldiers and civilians. He had demonstrated that the Eastern Roman Empire was, in many ways, completely helpless against him. And now he had his eyes on the West. Attila has brought the Eastern Roman Empire to its knees. But there's a whole other half of the Roman world he hasn't touched yet, the Western Roman Empire, based in Italy. And coming up next, an absolutely incredible story. A Roman princess sends Attila a letter and a ring, and Attila's response will set the entire Western world on fire. Chapter 5. The Princess, the Ring, and the Invasion of the West. Sometimes the most dramatic moments in history begin in completely unexpected ways. You might expect a massive invasion of Western Europe to begin with a grand battle plan, or a dispute over territory, or a broken treaty. But the invasion that Attila launched against the Western Roman Empire in 451 AD, it started because of a letter and a ring. Let me tell you about Honoria. Justa Grata Honoria was the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. She was an imperial princess, meaning she was one of the most high-born women in the entire Western world, and she was, by all accounts, absolutely miserable. See, Honoria had a problem that many royal women of the ancient world faced. She had no real power of her own. She was expected to live quietly, behave properly, make an appropriate marriage to someone her brother approved of, and basically stay out of politics. This did not sit well with Honoria, who seems to have been ambitious, headstrong, and deeply unhappy with her situation. Things came to a head when Honoria was caught in a secret romantic relationship with her household manager, a man named Eugenius. This was a huge scandal. Valentinian was furious. He had Eugenius executed, and he arranged for Honoria to be betrothed. That means engaged to be married, to a boring, safe, reliable Roman senator named Flavius Bassus Herculanus, someone who would keep her in line. Honoria was outraged, and so she did something extraordinary. She smuggled a letter out of Constantinople, where she was being kept under a kind of house arrest, and sent it to the one man she thought might be able to help her, Attila the Hun. With the letter, she sent a ring. Now, the exact contents of the letter are lost to history, but historians believe she was essentially asking Attila to intervene on her behalf, to rescue her from the marriage her brother was forcing on her. Some ancient sources say she was effectively proposing to Attila himself, though this is debated. Whether a marriage was actually her intention or not, she was reaching out to the most dangerous and powerful man outside the Roman world for help. Attila's response was breathtaking in its audacity. He interpreted the ring as an engagement ring. He sent a message to Valentinian claiming that Honoria was his fiancée, that she had offered him half the Western Empire as a dowry, a kind of payment a bride's family makes when she marries, and that he expected both Honoria and the territories to be handed over to him. Valentinian, as you can imagine, was furious. He refused entirely. Honoria was sent away in disgrace. She was separated from her brother's court and kept even more tightly confined. But Attila had what he wanted, a reason, a justification, however questionable, for crossing into the Western Roman Empire and taking what he now claimed was rightfully his. In the spring of 451 AD, Attila gathered his army. Historians estimate the size of this army at anywhere from 200,000 to 500,000 warriors, though these ancient numbers are notoriously hard to verify, and some modern scholars believe the actual number may have been lower. Even at a more conservative estimate, it was one of the largest armies ever assembled in the ancient world. This army included not just Hunnic warriors, but warriors from every people the Huns had conquered or allied with: Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Syrians, Thuringians, Franks, and many more. It was a vast multi-ethnic coalition, all marching under Attila's banner. This enormous force crossed the Rhine River into Gaul, the region we know today as France, Belgium, and Western Germany, like a tidal wave. Town after town was destroyed. Divadurum, that's modern Metz in France, was burned on Good Friday, April 7, 451 AD. The cities of Rheims, Troy, Arras, and others suffered devastating attacks. The Roman province of Gaul was being torn apart. Refugees flooded the roads. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble and ash in days. But this time, something was different. This time Rome had a plan, and the man behind that plan was someone we briefly mentioned earlier, that Roman boy who had once lived among the Huns as a diplomatic hostage, a man who knew Hunnic tactics from the inside. His name was Flavius Aetius, and he was about to earn himself the title that history would give him forever after, the last of the Romans. Attila's army is tearing through Gaul. Hundreds of thousands of warriors are burning everything in their path, and the one man who might be able to stop them is racing to gather the most unlikely alliance in Roman history. What happens next is one of the most dramatic battles in the entire ancient world. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 6, The Last of the Romans, Aetius and the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Flavius Aetius was in many ways Attila's mirror image. Where Attila had spent time as a youth living among the Romans, learning their ways, Aetius had spent his early years as a hostage among the Huns, learning their ways. He spoke the Hunnic language. He understood their tactics. He had actually fought alongside Hunnic warriors before. In fact, Aetius had used Hunnic mercenaries, hired soldiers, to help him win his own political battles in Rome. Aetius was brilliant, ruthless, politically savvy, and probably the most skilled military commander the Western Roman Empire had left. And he understood something crucial about stopping Attila that most Roman commanders didn't. You couldn't stop the Huns alone. Rome's legions, as mighty as they once were, had been weakened by decades of internal conflict, political instability, and the loss of territory. The Western Empire simply didn't have enough soldiers to face Attila's massive force by itself. So Aetius did something extraordinary. He made alliances, deals, partnerships with the very barbarian peoples who had been Rome's enemies for generations. The Visigoths, a powerful Germanic people living in what is today southern France and Spain, had fought Rome many times. Their king, an elderly but respected warrior named Theodoric I, had reasons to distrust Rome, but he had even more reasons to fear Attila. The Huns weren't going to stop with Rome. They were a threat to everyone. Aetius and Theodoric formed an alliance, and they were joined by other groups, Alans, Burgundians, and various Frankish and Saxon warriors, creating a combined Roman and allied force that marched to meet Attila. The two armies found each other in late June of 451 AD on a flat plain in what is today the Champagne region of northeastern France. Ancient sources call the location the Catalonian Plains, or sometimes the Campus Moriacus. The exact spot is still debated by historians today. What followed was one of the most enormous and brutal battles in the entire history of the ancient world. Ancient sources, who were sometimes prone to exaggeration, say that the battle involved hundreds of thousands of warriors on both sides and that the casualties were catastrophic. The 6th century historian Jordanes wrote that the battle was so fierce and so bloody that, according to legend, the spirits of the dead warriors rose from the battlefield and kept fighting in the sky above it all through the night. That's probably not literally true, of course, but it tells you what people thought about this battle, that it was so immense, so violent, so significant that it seemed almost supernatural. Here's what we do know happened. The battle began in the late afternoon, perhaps deliberately on Attila's part, since fighting in the remaining hours of daylight would reduce his archers' advantage. Fighting was ferocious on every section of the battlefield. The critical moment came when the Visigoth king, Theodoric I, was killed in the fighting, either thrown from his horse and trampled, or struck down directly in combat. This enraged the Visigoths, who fought with renewed furious intensity in his memory. By nightfall, neither side had completely broken the other, but Attila's forces had been pushed back and were now behind their defensive line of wagons, a formation called a lager, where warriors formed a defensive circle of wagons to protect against attack. Attila himself, according to Jordanes, had a funeral pyre built of horse saddles inside the wagon circle, so that if the Romans stormed the camp and breached it, he could throw himself onto the flames rather than be captured. That is how seriously he took this moment. But the Romans and their allies did not storm the camp. Why? This is one of history's great debates. Aetius ordered his forces to pull back. There are a few possible reasons. One is that he genuinely feared a final desperate Hunnic charge. A cornered Attila might be even more dangerous than a free one. Another theory, darker and more politically cynical, is that Aetius actually wanted Attila to survive, because if the Huns were completely destroyed, the Visigoths would become too powerful, and Rome would simply face a different threat. Aetius may have been carefully maintaining a balance of power. Whatever the reason, Attila was allowed to withdraw. He retreated back across the Rhine, taking his forces back into the Hunnic heartland. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, sometimes called the Battle of Chalons, was the first time in his career that Attila had been stopped. He had not been defeated completely, but he had been turned back, held. For the first time, the world saw that Attila could be resisted. It was, and remains today, one of the most important battles in Western history. Historians have argued that if Attila had won that battle and continued his march through Gaul and possibly into Spain and beyond, the entire course of Western civilization might have been different. The Christian kingdoms of Western Europe might never have developed in the way they did. The world we live in today might look very, very different. Did you know? Theodoric's son, Thorismund was present at the battle when his father died. According to Jordanes, he nearly perished himself in the chaos of the night fighting. After the battle, Aetius quietly encouraged Thorismund to rush home to secure his position as the new Visigoth king, partly out of genuine advice, but also, historians believe, to get the Visigoths away from the battlefield before they could press the attack on Attila further. It was clever, two-faced politics at its finest. Attila has been stopped in Gaul, but he is not finished. The very next year, 452 AD, he comes back, and this time he heads straight for Italy. The eternal city of Rome is in his sights. What happens next involves one of the most mysterious and dramatic confrontations in all of history, a meeting between Attila and one of the most powerful men in the Christian world. Prepare yourself. Chapter 7. The invasion of Italy and the meeting with Pope Leo. Attila was not the kind of man who accepted setbacks gracefully. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains had stopped his western push, but only temporarily. In the spring of 452 AD, Attila launched a new campaign. This time, instead of going through Gaul, he turned south. He was heading into Italy. The Italian campaign began with a siege. Aquileia was one of the most important cities in northeastern Italy, a massive, wealthy Roman city that sat at the head of the Adriatic Sea, guarding the entrance into Italy's heartland. It was heavily fortified and stocked with supplies, and its defenders initially held out against the Hunnic attack. According to one ancient account, Attila had almost decided to give up the siege and move on. Walls were always a problem for the Huns, who excelled at open-field combat rather than the slow, grinding business of besieging fortified cities. But then, according to the story, Attila noticed a remarkable thing. Storks, large wading birds that nested on the rooftops of Aquileia, were flying away from the city, carrying their young with them. Attila pointed at the departing birds and told his commanders, "Look, even the animals can sense what is about to happen. They are leaving. The city is about to fall." Whether or not this story is literally true, it served a purpose. It renewed his army's fighting spirit. The siege continued, and not long after, Aquileia was breached. What the Huns did to Aquileia was so complete and so devastating that ancient writers described the city as being virtually wiped off the face of the earth. The Roman historian Jordanes wrote that one could barely tell a city had ever stood there. The city never fully recovered, its population scattered, and never returned in the same numbers. In fact, many of the terrified Aquileian survivors who fled the Huns took refuge in the marshy, island-dotted lagoon on the Adriatic coast not far away. They built small settlements on the islands there. Over generations, those small refugee settlements grew into one of the most beautiful and remarkable cities in human history. That city is Venice. Extraordinary, isn't it? Venice, with its canals and gondolas and stunning architecture, quite possibly owes its existence in part to people running away from Attila the Hun. After Aquileia, Attila's forces swept through northern Italy almost unopposed. The great Roman cities fell or surrendered one by one. Patavium, modern Padua, Mediolanum, modern Milan, Ticinum, modern Pavia, Verona, Vicenza, Brescia, Bergamo. The Western Emperor, Valentinian III, had already fled the capital, which at that time was not Rome itself, but the city of Ravenna, for the safety of Rome. Attila was now moving closer to Rome itself. And here is where history gives us one of its most dramatic and mysterious moments. In 452 AD, on the banks of the Mincio River near the town of Mantua in northern Italy, Attila met a delegation. The Western Empire had sent 3 men to negotiate. One was a senior Roman official, one was a former consul, and one, the leader of the delegation, the man who would do the talking, was Pope Leo I, the Bishop of Rome, the leader of the Christian Church in the Western world. Now, at this point in history, the Pope was not yet the all-powerful political figure he would become in later centuries. But he was enormously prestigious. He was the spiritual leader of millions of Christians across the entire Western world. And he had tremendous personal authority and dignity. Leo walked into that meeting, and he spoke with Attila. We don't know exactly what was said. No transcript survives. But we know the outcome. Attila agreed to withdraw from Italy without marching on Rome. Why? This has been debated for 1600 years. Later Christian writers, including Pope Gregory the Great, claimed that Attila saw a vision during the meeting. The figures of the apostles Peter and Paul, appearing in the air behind the Pope with swords drawn, threatening Attila if he did not leave. This was, of course, a miracle story told by people who deeply believed in divine intervention. Modern historians offer more practical explanations. First, Attila's army was actually in bad shape. The Italian campaign had been hard. There had been famine. The land had been so devastated that even Attila's forces were struggling to find enough food. Disease may have been spreading through the camp. Second, the Eastern Roman Emperor, Marcian, had taken advantage of Attila's absence to stop paying tribute and to send a new Roman army across the Danube into Hunnic territory. Attila may have needed to go back to deal with that. Third, a return journey through Italy with a weakened army laden with plunder would have been risky. Disease, famine, and a resurgent Roman army could have proved costly. Whatever the reason, Attila turned around. He rode north, crossed the Alps, and returned to his homeland. Rome was saved, not by a great victory in battle, but by a combination of practicality, diplomacy, and, to those who believed it, divine intervention. And for centuries afterward, Pope Leo I would be celebrated as the man who turned back the scourge of God with nothing but the power of his words. Attila is back in his homeland, surrounded by luxury and wealth beyond imagination. Gold from Rome, tribute from dozens of peoples, the spoils of decades of conquest. He has survived battles, negotiations, and campaigns that destroyed everyone who challenged him. He is at the absolute peak of his power. And yet, history has one final shocking surprise in store. Coming up, the last night of Attila the Hun. Chapter 8, The Man Behind the Legend. How did Attila actually live? Before we get to the end of Attila's story, let's step back for a moment. Because throughout this video, we've been talking about battles and invasions and gold payments, and that can make Attila seem less like a real human being and more like some kind of unstoppable force of nature, a storm in human form. But Attila was a real human being. He ate, he slept, he had favorite foods, he had family, he had a home. So what was his actual life like day to day? We are incredibly lucky that a historian named Priscus of Panium actually visited Attila's court in 449 AD, right in the middle of Attila's power, and wrote a detailed description of what he saw. Priscus was part of a Roman diplomatic delegation sent to negotiate with Attila, and he was a careful observer who recorded his experiences in extraordinary detail. His account survives, at least in fragments, and it is one of the most fascinating documents from the ancient world. Here's what Priscus described. Attila's capital was not a grand city of stone and marble like Rome. It was essentially a very large, very well-organized collection of wooden buildings and tents on the plains of what is today Hungary. The Huns hadn't abandoned their nomadic roots. Even their royal court had the character of a permanent camp rather than a European-style palace. But don't let that fool you into thinking it was primitive. The complex where Attila lived was extensive. There were large wooden halls for feasting and meetings. There were separate buildings for his many wives, his children, and his most important subordinates. There were bathhouses built by Roman craftsmen who had been captured or hired. There were extensive wooden fortifications, walls, and gates. It was, by the standards of the steppe peoples, an impressively large and organized settlement. And it was absolutely packed with wealth. Gold, silver, precious gems, fine Roman cloth, silk from as far away as China, carved ivory, elaborate weapons decorated with gold and precious stones. The plunder and tribute of decades of conquest was stored and displayed here. Now here's the fascinating part, the part that made Priscus himself blink and stare in surprise. In the middle of all this luxury, Attila himself lived simply. At the great feast that Priscus attended, a massive banquet where food and drink were served on silver and gold platters to Attila's guests, Attila ate from a plain wooden plate. He drank from a plain wooden cup. His guests wore elaborate clothing decorated with gold and jewels. Attila wore simple, plain clothes, clean and neat, but undecorated. His sword had no gold or gems on the hilt. It was again plain. This was deliberate. This was a statement. Attila was demonstrating, every single day, that he was above the need for showing off. He didn't need to drape himself in gold to prove his power. Everyone already knew who he was. The gold and luxury around him were the tribute of defeated peoples. He could have it, but he didn't need to wear it. His power came from within, not from decoration. Priscus also described Attila physically. He was of medium height, with a broad chest, a large head, small, deep-set eyes, a flat nose, and a thin beard with some gray in it. His gaze was described as proud and fierce, the kind of eyes that made people uncomfortable to look into for too long. He was also described as quick-witted, often using irony and humor in conversation, though his humor could be sharp and even cruel. Attila had multiple wives, as was customary for powerful rulers in the Hunnic culture. Among them, his favorite was reportedly a woman named Ildiko. He also had many children, including several sons, among them Elak, Dengizic, and Ernach, who would play roles in Hunnic history after his death. He ruled his court through a combination of personal authority, strategic intelligence, and the very real threat of violence for those who crossed him. He rewarded loyalty generously and punished betrayal absolutely. Did you know? Priscus describes an encounter at Attila's court that almost ended in a very diplomatic disaster. During the visit, one of the Roman delegation, a man named Vigilas, was actually caught carrying a large sum of gold that he was secretly planning to use to bribe someone to assassinate Attila. Attila's intelligence network was so good that he found out about the plot before it could be carried out. He confronted Vigilas, stripped him of the gold, and sent him back to Rome to bring even more gold as a punishment, essentially turning an assassination attempt into yet another tribute payment. The sheer confidence and control of that response is remarkable. What strikes modern historians most about Attila is his combination of qualities that seem almost contradictory. He was savage in war and restrained in personal habits. He was feared everywhere and genuinely loved by his own warriors. He was from a culture without writing and yet was sophisticated enough to outmaneuver professional Roman diplomats. He destroyed dozens of cities and yet had a deep appreciation for skilled craftsmen, musicians, and artists. His court was full of them. He was, by any measure, one of the most complex and remarkable figures of the ancient world. We've seen him in battle, at the negotiating table, and in his home. But now comes the moment that shocked the entire world, the death of Attila, and the circumstances surrounding it are so strange, so sudden, so unexpected, that historians have been trying to make sense of them ever since. The final chapter is just ahead, Chapter 9, The Night of the Wedding, the mysterious death of Attila the Hun. It was the spring of 453 AD. Attila was making plans. Big plans. After the Italian campaign, he had turned his attention east, toward the Eastern Roman Empire, which under its new emperor Marcian had stopped paying tribute entirely. Attila was furious about this, and was reportedly preparing a new, massive campaign to punish Constantinople once and for all. He was also making arrangements closer to home. He was taking a new wife. Her name was Ildiko. She was described as a beautiful young woman, possibly of Germanic origin. The wedding was arranged to take place at Attila's great wooden court on the Hungarian plains, and it was to be celebrated with an enormous feast, as befitted the most powerful man in the world. The night of the wedding, Attila feasted. He ate, he drank, reportedly more than usual, which for a man known for his moderate habits was itself unusual. His warriors celebrated around him, music played, wine and mead, a honey-based alcoholic drink, flowed freely. Late in the evening, Attila retired to his private chamber with his new bride. The next morning, the wedding guests waited. Attila did not appear. Paused. Still nothing. His guards and servants, growing nervous, because nobody kept Attila waiting, it was always the other way around, eventually knocked on the door of his chamber. Finally, after much hesitation, they forced the door open. What they found inside was one of the most shocking scenes in the history of the ancient world. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, the man who had terrified Rome, the conqueror of half a continent, was dead. He lay on his back on his bed, in a pool of blood. There was no wound on his body, no sign of any struggle, no weapon. Beside him, Ildiko sat veiled and weeping. The cause of death, according to the account of the historian Priscus, who was reporting what people at the Hunnic court told him, was a massive nosebleed. It seems that in the night, after drinking heavily, Attila had suffered a hemorrhage, a severe internal bleeding event. Blood that had nowhere else to go had poured from his nose. In his heavy drunken sleep, he had been unable to wake or move, and he had drowned in his own blood. He was dead, by most estimates, somewhere between 45 and 58 years old. Just like that. No battle, no dramatic last stand, no fatal wound from a heroic enemy. The most feared warrior in the world died in bed, on his wedding night, of a nosebleed. Of course, people didn't entirely believe that then, and many historians have debated it since. Some ancient writers hinted that Ildiko might have killed him, that she was perhaps the daughter of a Germanic king who had been killed by the Huns, seeking revenge. This is a romantic story, and it captured people's imaginations enough that it was woven into later Germanic mythology and legend. But there is no solid historical evidence that Attila was murdered. Modern medical historians have proposed various explanations. Esophageal varices, a serious condition where veins in the throat rupture, often associated with heavy drinking. A simple but catastrophic nosebleed in someone who had drunk enough to not be able to sit up, or other internal hemorrhages. The truth is, we don't know for certain. The funeral of Attila was, by all accounts, extraordinary. According to Jordanes, the Huns chose their most skilled horsemen and had them ride around Attila's body in a circle, chanting a funeral song in his honor. The text of that chant, called a strava, was preserved by Jordanes, and it goes like this in translation. Chief of the Huns, King Attila, born of his sire Mundzuk, lord of the bravest tribes, who with power unheard of before his time, alone possessed the Scythian and Germanic kingdoms, and having captured cities of both empires, terrified both and, appeased by their prayers, took annual tribute to save the remainder from plunder. And when he had accomplished all this by his good fortune, he fell, not by wound of the foe, nor by treachery of friends, but in the midst of his nation at peace, happy in his joy and without sense of pain. His body was placed in 3 coffins, one inside another, the outermost of iron, symbolizing his strength, the middle one of silver, symbolizing his wealth, and the innermost of gold, symbolizing his glory. He was buried at night in a secret location. According to legend, after the burial was complete, the men who had done the burying were killed, so that no one would ever know exactly where Attila the Hun lay at rest. To this day, his grave has never been found. Attila is gone. But what happens next to his empire, his family, and his legacy? And why does a man who died 1600 years ago still fascinate us today? The final chapter, and it's one you won't want to miss. Chapter 10. The collapse of the Hunnic Empire and the legacy of Attila. Empires built on the strength of one person are almost always fragile, and the Hunnic Empire was almost entirely built on Attila. When he died in 453 AD, what happened next was almost painful to watch. If you had been a Hunnic warrior who had spent years following the greatest conqueror in the world. Attila left behind multiple sons. Among the most prominent were Elak, Dengizich, and Ernach, and immediately the question was, who leads next? The answer unfortunately was, all of them, and none of them. The sons of Attila began fighting among themselves almost immediately. Each had his own supporters, his own ambitions, his own vision for the future. Rather than cooperating, they divided the Hunnic realm between them, and then began competing for dominance. This was disastrous. Remember all those Germanic peoples, the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, the Rugians, who had been conquered by the Huns and forced to serve them? They had been waiting, biding their time, and now they saw their chance. In 454 AD, just 1 year after Attila's death, a massive revolt broke out, led by the Gepids under their king Ardaric. The rebels faced Attila's son Elak at the Battle of the Nidau River, in what is today Croatia or Hungary. Scholars debate the exact location. Elak was killed in the battle. The Hunnic forces were shattered. More battles followed over the next few years, and each one further weakened the Huns. The people who had cowered before them for decades were now fighting back, and winning. Dengizich, another of Attila's sons, continued fighting for years, eventually launching an attack on the Eastern Roman Empire in 469 AD. It failed catastrophically. Dengizich was killed, and his head was reportedly sent to Constantinople, where it was displayed in the city's hippodrome, the massive horse racing arena at the heart of the city. Think about that image for a moment. The son of the man who had once terrified Constantinople so badly that its emperor paid mountains of gold not to be attacked, his head on a stick, displayed for entertainment. Ernach, the youngest of Attila's prominent sons, led part of the remaining Hunnic peoples into what is today Bulgaria and Romania, where they settled and gradually merged with other local populations. And just like that, within about 20 years of Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire was essentially gone. No other empire in history rose so dramatically and collapsed so completely in such a short time. So what does it all mean? What was Attila's legacy? Let's think about this carefully, because the legacy of Attila is genuinely complicated. On one hand, Attila was responsible for enormous suffering. The cities he destroyed, many of them never rebuilt. The people killed, enslaved, or displaced by his campaigns. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, across multiple decades. The wealth drained from the Eastern Roman Empire in tribute payments was wealth that could have been used for roads, schools, aqueducts, and trade. On the other hand, and this is where history gets interesting, the pressure that the Huns placed on Europe had profound and lasting effects that shaped the world we live in today. The movement of peoples displaced by the Huns, Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, pushed deeper into Roman territory and eventually helped bring down the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. That collapse, while traumatic at the time, eventually allowed new kingdoms and cultures to develop, the kingdoms that would become France, Germany, England, Spain, and Italy. In a very real sense, the modern nations of Europe grew partly from the seeds planted by the chaos that Attila and the Huns helped create. The fall of Rome, which the Hunnic pressure accelerated, also created the conditions for the rise of medieval Christendom, the culture of castles, knights, cathedrals, and feudal kingdoms that most people associate with the Middle Ages. Without the fall of Rome, European history takes a completely different path. Is that Attila's legacy? In some indirect ways, yes. He didn't intend to reshape European civilization. He intended to conquer and plunder, but the butterfly effect of his actions echoed through centuries. And then there's how Attila lives in culture and mythology. The Germanic peoples who lived through the Hunnic era were so deeply marked by the experience that Attila became a major figure in their oral traditions and mythology. In Norse and Germanic mythology, a character called Atli, clearly based on Attila, appears in major works, including the Poetic Edda and the Volsung Saga, ancient Norse texts. He's also a character in the Nibelungenlied, the great German epic poem which was later used by the composer Richard Wagner as inspiration for his famous Ring Cycle opera. In these stories, Attila Atli is usually a villain, treacherous, greedy for gold, and ultimately destroyed by the revenge of those he wronged. This makes sense coming from Germanic peoples who had suffered under Hunnic rule. But in Hungarian tradition, Hungary being the country closest to the heart of Attila's former empire, Attila is remembered very differently. He is seen as a great ancestor, a mighty national hero. The Hungarian name Attila remains a common first name in Hungary today. Some medieval Hungarian chronicles even claimed that the Hungarian people were direct descendants of the Huns, though modern genetic and historical research suggests the connection is more complex. And in the popular imagination of the modern world, Attila has become a shorthand for unstoppable, terrifying power. When people want to describe someone as utterly ferocious or dominant, they still reach for his name, 1600 years after his death. The Scourge of God. Even that title, which was actually given to him by the Romans, partly as a theological way of explaining why God would allow someone so destructive to exist, they concluded he must be a divine punishment for Roman sins, became a permanent part of how history remembers him. And here is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. We don't have a single piece of writing that Attila himself created, no letters in his own hand, no orders, no autobiography, no speech. The Huns did not write. Everything we know about him comes from his enemies, Romans and Greeks, who feared and opposed him. And yet, even filtered through the words of people who hated him, who were trying to make him sound like a monster, the picture of Attila that comes through is still, somehow, genuinely impressive. He was brilliant. He was strategic. He was disciplined in his personal life, even as he was ferocious in war. He earned the loyalty of warriors from dozens of different peoples. He outmaneuvered professional diplomats. He turned a tribal chieftaincy into an empire that stretched from France to the Caspian Sea. Whatever you think of what he did with his power, and much of it was genuinely terrible, you cannot read his story without recognizing that Attila was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived. And now, as we close, let's take one final look at everything we've learned and ask the question that really matters. What can a ninth grade student living today, more than 1600 years later, actually take away from the life of Attila the Hun? So here we are. We've traveled all the way from the open grasslands of Central Asia, across the plains of Hungary, through the burning cities of Gaul and Italy, to a wedding feast on the Hungarian plains on a spring night in 453 AD. We've met a boy who grew up on horseback, was sent to live with his enemies, came back wiser and more dangerous than before, and eventually built an empire so large and so fearsome that the greatest superpower in the world paid him mountains of gold just to stay away. We've seen him stop at the gates of Constantinople, not because he couldn't scare Rome, but because walls couldn't be scared. We've seen him turn back from Rome when a pope met him on a riverbank. We've seen him die, suddenly and inexplicably, on a night when the world expected him to live forever. What do we do with a story like that? Because Attila's story isn't comfortable. He wasn't a hero in the way we usually use that word. He caused enormous suffering. Entire cities, entire communities of people, real families with children and grandparents and pets and hopes and dreams were destroyed because of his campaigns. That matters. It should not be forgotten. But history isn't just a collection of stories about good people doing good things. History is the true, messy, complicated record of what human beings actually did. All of it. And if we only study the comfortable parts, we miss something important. Attila's story teaches us things about power, how it's won, how it's used, how quickly it can vanish when the person holding it is gone. It teaches us things about the ancient world, how interconnected it already was, how empires rose and fell, how ordinary people's lives could be completely upended by forces far beyond their control. It teaches us about fear and about courage, about how even the most terrifying threats in history were eventually survived by the people who faced them. Rome bent, it suffered, it paid enormous sums of gold, it lost cities and armies, but it kept going. And the people who scattered before the Huns, refugees like the people of Aquileia who built Venice in a swamp, they kept going too. They built something new, something beautiful. And Attila's story teaches us something about how history works, about how one person in one generation can set in motion changes that echo for centuries. Not always the changes they intended, not always the ones anyone wanted, but changes that ripple forward through time, shaping the world that eventually produces you, sitting here, watching this video. You exist in a world partly shaped by the movements of people fleeing the Huns 1,600 years ago. The countries of Europe, the culture of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, the stories in Norse mythology, all of these were touched, however distantly, by the tremors that Attila sent through history. That's how connected we are to the past. That's why history matters. So the next time someone asks you what you know about the ancient world, the Roman Empire, or the so-called barbarian peoples, you can tell them something that most adults don't know. You can tell them that there was a boy born on the open plains of Central Asia around the year 4 to 6 AD, that he learned to ride before he could walk, that he was sent to live among his enemies and came back understanding them better than they understood themselves, that he united dozens of warrior peoples under one banner, that he terrified the most powerful empire in the world so badly that it paid him 700 pounds of gold a year just to stay away, that he was stopped on the plains of France by an alliance that should have been impossible, that he spared Rome when a churchman met him on a riverbank, and that he died, not in battle, not in glory, but quietly on his wedding night, with no one watching but one weeping bride. The most feared man in the world. Gone. Just like that. Attila the Hun, born around 406, died 453, king of the Huns, conqueror of half a continent, scourge of God. One of the most remarkable human beings who ever drew breath on this earth. And now you know his story.